So what if I told you that there is a supplement that has been shown in human clinical trials to improve blood sugar, reduce inflammation, and modestly improve cardiovascular risk markers? And most people either overhype it or completely ignore it. That supplement is black seed oil. And it's one of those products that seems to be everywhere. We see it in the health food stores. We hear it in the podcasts, online comment sections. And sooner or later, someone says, this stuff cures everything. Well, whenever I hear that, my scientist brain gets a little suspicious because what I've learned in biology, almost nothing cures everything. But a few things do show consistent, repeatable benefits when you look carefully at the data. So today we're going to slow this down and do something slightly unfashionable. We're going to look at human clinical trials, randomized trials, meta-analyses, not anecdotes, not marketing copy, and not mouse miracles. We're going to ask a simple question. Does black seed oil offer measurable benefits for metabolic health, for inflammation, or cardiovascular risk, especially for those of us in our senior years? And since this is GLP-1s for seniors, we're also going to talk about where something like this might or might not fit alongside modern metabolic therapy. No hype, no miracles, just the evidence and context. Before we go any further, a quick introduction. If you're new here, welcome. I'm George Logan. I'm not a doctor, and I don't give medical advice. But I am a biological scientist, and my professional life has been spent looking at systems, evidence, and how biology actually behaves in the real world, not just in theory. This channel exists for a simple reason. There is no shortage of health information out there. But there is shortage of careful, calm interpretation, especially for those of us in our senior years. I also want to be transparent about something. I am currently on my own GLP-1 journey, and I've been on it for a little over 5 months now. I share that not as proof of anything, but as context. It's why I'm especially interested in metabolic health and inflammation, and interventions that might reasonably support, not replace, evidence-based therapy. And before we get into the trials, a quick word about the little plant itself. Black seed oil comes from Nigella sativa. It's a small flowering plant native to parts of the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia. And the oil is pressed from the seeds. And it's primarily a bioactive compound that we're interested in. It's called thymoquinone, which is what most of the clinical research is actually focused on. So as we go through black seed oil today, the lens will always be the same. What do human clinical trials show? What's plausible? What's modest? And what belongs in the category of interesting but unproven, at least till now? And that's the framework that I'll use for everything that will follow. Okay, with that context in mind, let's start with metabolic health. And this is where black seed oil, specifically compounds derived from Nigella sativa, is some of the strongest human clinical evidence. The study I want to highlight here is a meta-analysis published in 2025, so very recently, by Carini and colleagues in the journal Clinical Nutrition ESPEN. This paper pooled data from 16 randomized controlled trials involving people with type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome. And across these trials, participants consumed black seed preparations, either oil or powder, for several weeks to a few months. And when the results were combined, the authors reported an average reduction in fasting blood glucose of roughly 20 milligrams per deciliter. And they also observed a reduction in hemoglobin A1C of about 0.4%. Now, it's important to put this in perspective. This is not GLP-1 level efficacy, and it should never be framed as a replacement for prescription therapy. But this also wasn't a single outlier result. These effects appeared consistently across multiple trials, using different populations and different formulations of Nigella sativa. And another important detail, it's time. Most of the trials ran 8 to 12 weeks or longer, which matters because A1C reflects longer long-term glucose control, usually 2 to 3 months, you don't see changes like this from a 1-week experiment. So the careful takeaway is this. Based on human clinical trials, black seed oil may provide a small but measurable benefit for insulin sensitivity and glycemic control, particularly in people already dealing with metabolic dysfunction. So this is not a miracle, but not meaningless either. Okay, so building on that, let's turn to inflammation. And this is important because chronic low-grade inflammation sits right at the intersection of metabolic disease, cardiovascular risk, joint symptoms, and aging itself. And this is also where the biology of Nigella sativa starts to make more sense. Much of the research focuses on thymoquinone, the primary bioactive compound in black seed oil, which has been shown to influence inflammatory signaling pathways. Now, the study I want to highlight here is a meta-analysis that was published in 2021 by Montezeri and colleagues in the journal Phytotherapy Research. And this paper analyzed randomized controlled trials that examine inflammatory and oxidative stress markers in people taking Nigella sativa preparations. And when the data was pooled, the authors reported statistically significant reductions in high sensitivity C-reactive protein, or hsCRP, which is a commonly used marker in systemic inflammation. They also observed improvements in several markers related to oxidative stress, suggesting a shift towards less inflammatory state. Now again, context matters. Now these were not massive drug-like effects. We're talking about modest but measurable changes that averaged across multiple trials with different populations and study designs. But what makes this meaningful is that the signal shows repeatedly, not just in one condition, but across studies involving metabolic disease, obesity-related inflammation, and inflammatory disorders. So the careful takeaway here is this. Based on human trials, black seed oil appears capable of nudging inflammatory markers in a favorable direction. And that doesn't mean it treats inflammatory disease. But for most people, particularly those dealing with metabolic inflammation, I was one of them, it may offer a small supportive benefit as part of a broader evidence-based approach to health. Again, not dramatic, but biological, plausible, and consistently observed. Next, let's talk about cardiovascular signals. We're not talking about heart attacks or strokes directly, but the risk markers that tend to shift long before these outcomes do. This is another area where the biology of Nigella sativa, this little plant we're talking about, overlaps with what we see clinically. Compounds like thymoquinone have been studied for their effects on lipid metabolism, on vascular inflammation and oxidative stress, all of which influence cardiovascular risk. So the study I want to highlight here is a larger meta-analysis published in 2025 by Jafari and colleagues in the journal Frontiers in Nutrition. This paper used grade-based approach to evaluate data from more than 80 randomized trials examining Nigella sativa and cardiometabolic risk factors. When the results were pooled, the authors reported modest but consistent improvements in several cardiovascular markers, including total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, triglycerides, and in some cases, blood pressure. And the effects tended to be more noticeable in people with metabolic syndrome or type 2 diabetes rather than completely healthy individuals. It's important to be very clear here. These changes are not what you'd expect from statins, from antihypertensives, or GLP-1 medications. This is not drug-level impact, but what makes these findings useful is that they point in the right direction, and they do so across a large number of randomized trials rather than relying on just one single study. And the authors also explored dose and duration and suggested that moderate daily dosing over roughly 12 weeks tended to produce the most consistent results. Again, this reinforces the idea that we're looking at cumulative supporting effects, not quick fixes. So the careful takeaway is this: black seed oil may modestly improve lipid profiles and blood pressure markers, particularly in people already dealing with metabolic risk. That doesn't make it a cardiovascular treatment, but as part of a broader evidence-based strategy alongside nutrition, movement, and appropriate medical care. It may help nudge overall risk in a favorable direction. Once again, not dramatic, but directionally meaningful. But before we move towards the wrap-up, we need to talk about dosing and safety. So this is often the least exciting slide, but I feel it's the most important one. Across the human trials we discussed, so far, black seed oil is most commonly studied in doses between 1 and 2 grams per day, and is usually taken daily for 8 to 12 weeks, and sometimes longer. And these doses are where the clearest signals for metabolic, inflammatory, and lipid effects tend to show up. In terms of safety, black seed oil is generally well tolerated in clinical trials. When side effects occur, they're usually mild and gastrointestinal. Things like taste issues, nausea, and mild stomach upset. Serious adverse effects are uncommon at the doses used in our human clinical trials. I also want to be transparent here. For context, not as evidence, I'm personally been taking about 2 grams per day for a little over 3 months now. And I share that simply to note that this falls squarely within the range used in published trials. It doesn't prove anything works. It doesn't mean it's right for everyone. But one important caution, especially for this audience. Because black seed oil may influence glucose levels and blood pressure, anyone taking diabetes medications or antihypertensives should monitor carefully and involve their clinician, involve your doctor. Additive effects are possible even when they're modest. So the reasonable framing is this: stay within the study dose ranges. Start conservatively. Pay attention to trends over time. How do you feel? And always treat supplements as adjuncts, not substitutes for evidence-based care. So before we wrap up, I want to place everything that we've discussed so far into a GLP-1 context. And this is not going to be advice, just a way of thinking about the evidence. So we all know that GLP-1 medications work through well-established mechanisms of appetite regulation, of insulin signaling, and improvements in metabolic efficiency. And a supplement like black seed oil does not replace that. It operates at best in an overlapping territory. Modest effects on insulin sensitivity and inflammation and cardiometabolic markers. And that's why the right framing is adjunct, not a substitute. Something that might gently support the same biological direction, but at a much smaller magnitude. And one practical advantage of being on a GLP-1 journey is awareness. People, myself included, tend to be more attentive to weight trends, to glucose readings, to blood pressure, to their lipid panels, to energy, to how they feel overall. And that makes it easier to evaluate whether an addition is doing something meaningful. Not day to day, but over weeks and months. It also reinforces something very important. Supplements don't stand alone. They sit on top of a foundation that includes adequate protein, resistance training, movement, sleep, and appropriate medical care. And without that foundation, stacking doesn't work. So the mindset I try to keep and encourage others to keep is simple: cautious, curious, and guided by trends, not by expectations. And before we bring all this to a close, I want to start by saying thank you. If you have made it to this point in this video, it tells me something quite important. It tells me you're thinking carefully about your health, and I respect that. I also want to say this plainly. I really enjoy going deep on topics like this. kind of slowing things down, looking carefully at the evidence, and trying to separate what's interesting from what's actually supported by human clinical data. And just for transparency, there are many more studies on black seed oil than the ones that we highlighted today. And I looked at a broad range of these trials and reviews and made a deliberate choice to focus on just a few higher quality examples so we could stay grounded without disappearing completely into the weeds, which I tend to kind of sometimes do. And yes, given the topic, that felt like an appropriate metaphor. The big takeaway is this: supplements like black seed oil are best understood as supportive tools, not cures, not shortcuts, and not replacements for good medical care. The evidence suggests modest benefits for metabolic health, for inflammation and cardiovascular risk markers when they're used thoughtfully and in the right context. And if you're interested in the more personal side of this journey of mine, I also publish separate shorter videos on this channel with weekly updates on my own GLP-1 experience. In those videos, what I try to do is to share what I'm learning, what's working, what's been challenging, practical tips and tweaks, if you will, and small adjustments that I have found helpful. And from time to time, I will also share GLP-1 focused food ideas and recipes that I'm developing myself that are realistic, senior-friendly, and metabolically sensible. My hope is that this channel helps you think clearly, move carefully, and make decisions rooted in the evidence, not hype. So thanks again for spending a part of your day with me. Stay curious, be at peace. This is George with GLP-1 for Seniors, and I will see you next time.